All right, so everyone should see a blue screen that says talking with young children about race. Um, so let's go ahead and jump in. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining me tonight to learn more about talking with young children about race. My name is Alea Perez, and I am the head of the Kids Library here at the Elmhurst Public Library. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. I will be recording our session, as I mentioned just a moment ago, but as we get towards the end of my portion where I'm sharing information with you, and as we move into a portion where I will open things up for questions or discussion, I would want you to know that I will be stopping the recording at that time. I do want to make sure that you feel comfortable as we engage in this learning opportunity, and I feel like turning the recording off at that point will go a long way towards helping with that. I will ask that for this first portion, you do keep your mic muted. It's up to you whether or not you want to turn off your camera, but I definitely ask about the mic, please. And when it's time for us to get to that discussion and question portion, we're going to do our best to take turns using the technology that we have available to do so. Lastly, I'd like to ask that we all do our absolute best tonight throughout this program to be respectful of each other's learning process. It's a somewhat heavy topic in some regards, so I want to make sure that we are giving ourselves space to ask questions and learn as best as we can. All right, so tonight, the things that we're going to be talking about, common reasons why we don't discuss the topic of race either at all with our children or more than we already do if you talk about it with them. We're also going to discuss why it's important that you regularly discuss this. And again, why it's important that you start if you're currently not. We're going to cover how to start the conversation. And we're going to be discussing why it's important to do more than talk about it. And then, as I mentioned before, lastly, we're going to open up the space to any questions that you have or any comments that you may have on anything that I'm sharing with you today. All right, so the question, why don't we discuss this, or why don't we discuss this more with children? We're going to take a step back. Race, biologically speaking, is not something that actually exists. Race instead is a social construct. It is something that was created by people in order to create reason, meaning, or purpose in explaining things that we both like and dislike about other groups or people. So because it's something that people created, it is something that people can also work toward removing. But that's going to take a tremendous amount of effort, and it's going to take a lot of talking. Yet, race and racism are often the elephant in the room. We struggle to acknowledge this, not just with others, but with ourselves. And this is why it can be a struggle to talk about it with other adults, let alone with children, particularly those who are pretty young. So why is it that we don't discuss this at all or more frequently with children? So some of the reasons that are commonly brought up for why people do not talk about this with their young children is they say they either want to keep their innocence or similarly, they don't want to traumatize them. Now, the unfortunate news is even if you don't talk about this with them, they're going to discover this. So even if your children currently move around in or exist in spaces such as your neighborhood, their school, other social settings that are predominantly other children or other people of the same race that you are or the same ethnicity as you and your family, it's important to acknowledge that a much larger and more diverse world exists, and you want to prepare them for what takes place in that world and who they're going to meet in it, both for their benefit and the benefit of others. There's also the common issue of, I don't know enough about the topic, or I'm uncertain of where to start. So the good news here, you don't have to go into these conversations with your children knowing everything there is to know about either race or racism. None of us have that knowledge set. But what you do need to do or be willing to do is the sustained work that you will have to go through to ensure that you continue to learn so that you can guide your children. It is also okay when you're talking about them with us to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, but you're willing to find them out and you would like for them to learn alongside you. That can be really powerful for children in helping to give them some sense of responsibility for the learning that they're doing, even at a young age. Another reason why people possibly don't talk about this, the topic's uncomfortable for me as the adult to have to face or grapple with it. So it should be unsurprising to know that many people struggle with openly discussing the topic of race, even if you're not going into the negative aspects of it like racism. They're often afraid that they're going to say something wrong or something offensive. And in many cases, people would just rather not try than try and risk a chance of making a mistake. But it's not only okay, it is actually necessary that we be able to talk about race and that we be able to explicitly name not just the things that we have in common with other people, but also the things that make us different and how that is also including our identities. And that's where race can come in. So something that would make a lot of people uncomfortable is to say that someone is Black. But it's okay to say someone is Black. It's also okay to say that someone is white. And children should hear us as adults using those words, Black, white. There's any other number of words that we can use depending on the group we're referring to. But children should also hear us use the words race and racism. Those are not bad words in and of themselves. And although it can take some getting used to, because again, we've spent so much time as a society not using them, with practice, it can begin to feel much more familiar and much more comfortable. Now, the last reason I tend to hear people say why they don't talk about this is simply because they feel they don't have to. It's the case that for some racial or ethnic groups, primarily those who do not identify as members of marginalized groups. So when I say marginalized, I'm going to be referring to Black, Indigenous, or Native American, or other persons of color. So not just for those who don't identify as one of those, but also for those who actually are or who pass as white. Experiencing the effects of their race is not an overt part of their everyday experience. It's something that they don't always feel they have to acknowledge or address. It typically doesn't come up a lot for them. But the reality is, even if you don't feel the negative effects of your race, and again, this is primarily going to be for those who are white or white passing, you're still very likely experiencing the benefits or the positive effects of that. So this doesn't actually mean that race doesn't matter for this group. It just means that those folks who fall within that can more easily choose to ignore it or to treat it as though it's not a big deal. But why it's important. So that is the ultimate question here. Why is it important to talk with children about this topic? So as I mentioned earlier, children still learn about race, even if we as the adults in their life don't actively or directly address it ourselves. So as Kendra Flanagan, the Director of Teaching and Learning for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, has been quoted as saying, adults might want to turn off the TV or be silent, but kids are getting their information and their understanding from other places. So it makes it that much more important to have these conversations so that they are getting outside messages that are different from what you as the parent or you as the caregiver want them to have. So again, ultimately, whether or not you choose to discuss it openly, your children are sponges. They are learning about race and they're noticing it in the world around them, even in nonverbal ways. So studies have been done on young children, and what they've shown is that children as young as 3 months of age, so babies, are capable of seeing differences in appearance and look more at faces that match the race of their caregivers. So they can tell when someone looks similar to them or not. Um, as early as 2 years old, children are able to start assigning reason to behaviors based on race. So to use a very general kind of phrase or situation, those people or that group do this thing because they are different than me. So 2-year-olds are able to make that rationale in their own minds. By 5, children have learned to associate status or the belief that some people are better than others based on race. So they have picked up on these beliefs from the adults that they observe, maybe not always in their immediate setting, so maybe not at home, but they do pick these up in other settings. So this can be happening in person, through school, through other community arenas, or it can be something that they're picking up in media. But by 5 o'clock, by the time they're 5, they recognize that status exists based on race. So it's my hope that we can all agree that it's important to imbue a healthy racial identity in our children, and that's regardless of race. But at the same time, we hopefully want to teach them to appreciate and respect those who are different than them. So it's important to have these conversations, in large part because so many of us who are now adults were taught the incredibly well-meaning but ultimately very harmful concept of colorblindness when we were growing up. So colorblindness, if you're unfamiliar with that term, simply means that you say you don't, or you choose not to, or in your mind you genuinely don't think that you notice race, that you don't see people differently because of the color of their skin. But teaching children that you don't see race, that you don't recognize it, that you believe that you are colorblind, tends to stop these very important conversations before they can even start. It lets your children know that you don't see this as either a legitimate thing or as something worth tackling. So what it ultimately ends up doing is erasing or diminishing the very real lived experiences of many Black, Indigenous, or other people of color who have felt the effects of society's real lack of colorblindness. So we can say we don't believe in colorblind, or we are colorblind, that we don't believe that we see race, but there are very real situations that happen in our lives that prove otherwise. So what are some of the types of lived experiences that people might have, and where and how do they occur? You can look at the issue of racism across generations. So that's the broadest way that we experience this particular issue. Racial discrimination that happens in one generation can, unfortunately, negatively impact the health, the economic opportunities, and wealth accumulation, not just for that particular group's generation, but also for the generations that follow. Racism, or the issues pertaining to race, can also be experienced within a domain. So if you experience discrimination or racism as a child, let's say in an early stage of your schooling, in preschool, in kindergarten, in first grade, that is very likely to contribute to and lead to poor performance later. And that is, something that can be cumulative, that can catch up to you, so that by the time you're in middle school, by the time you're in high school, you might not be doing as well as you otherwise would have in a safer environment, which can then lead to diminishing opportunities for college or other schooling opportunities. Lastly, it can be experienced across domains. So being discriminated against in one sphere of life ultimately does not stay within that sphere. It can leak out and move across. So just as an example, if you live in a segregated neighborhood, you may not have quick or easy access to grocery stores, to jobs, to certain types of healthcare. And then this is going to, again, have a cumulative effect. It's going to make things more difficult, not just for you, but most likely for the generations that follow. So let's kind of tie this back to children. What does all of that have to do with children? There have been studies that show that there's a very serious impact of children and their parents, their caregivers, being on the receiving end of racism or discrimination. And some of those impacts are links to birth disparities. So there have been findings of higher infant mortality rates or lower birth weights when you're comparing across Black and white demographics. You also see amongst children mental health problems. And that isn't just for children, but that also extends into the teen years, which again can have an impact on the experience of those children as they then become adults themselves and then raise their own children. So it's a very continuing cycle, very cyclical thing, which makes it all the more important that we address this while our children are still young so that we can hopefully teach those who are likely to be on the receiving end how they can break that cycle and teach those who are likely to be on the beneficial end of that how to be better community members, how to be better neighbors and allies. So there was a lot of very heavy stuff in there. So you might understand why all of that makes it difficult to speak to children about this topic. It can make it feel like a very monumental task because of how it impacts all of these areas of our lives. But talking to children about this topic serves a good purpose. It helps to normalize other races, other ethnicities to which they don't belong, which then begins to combat the issue of those groups, again, particularly those who are marginalized, continuing to be dehumanized and othered. So it helps to combat that. It helps to make that stop, which again, I hope we can all agree is what we would like to see happen. Okay, so the question then becomes, we know it's important to have these conversations. We know why we don't want to have these conversations, but how do we actually start the conversation? How do we dive into this topic? So before we start discussing that portion, I want to make sure that you as a caregiver or as a parent understand, and it's imperative that you remember this, you as your child's parent or caregiver are going to be the expert on that child. You may not have the expertise on race or racism, that's okay, but you are the expert on that child. So you're going to have the best insights on what that child needs in terms of the delivery and the approach and the specificity of the types of information that you are sharing with them. So while we don't want to shelter children from this topic, from these conversations, it's also really important that we don't traumatize them. There's some communities where there's already going to be quite a bit of trauma in their upbringing. And the point of having these conversations is really not to drag other people down and give them this trauma as well. It's hopefully to educate and to lift those up who are experiencing these traumas. So the three things that we want to make sure we keep in mind as we are having these conversations are that they remain honest, that they remain age appropriate, and that they are ongoing. And that last one is incredibly important. I trust that you all are capable of doing honest conversations and that you know how to speak to a child in a way that is appropriate for where they are. But most people do struggle with keeping the conversation going. They think it's something that they can mention once or twice here or there, and they're done. They've done their due diligence. But this is something that hopefully for not just your child, but for you as well, becomes a lifelong learning opportunity. Now, it may come as little surprise to you all that I think books can be a really great path to beginning that conversation. So we're going to take just the next few moments, assuming the technology works with me here, to share a book that I think does a really excellent job of beginning to tackle the concept of race, the concept of racism, and does so in a way that is straightforward and really child-friendly, again, in my opinion.
My name's Jelani Memory, and this is a kid's book about racism. This is a book about racism, for reals, and yes, it really is for kids. It's a good book to read with a grown-up, because you'll have lots to talk about afterward. Just you, keep reading. The book won't bite. Now to introduce myself. My name is Jelani. My skin color looks like this. If you're colorblind, this is the color brown. Because my dad is black and my mom is white, which makes me mixed. Or African American, biracial, black, or a person of color. I'm proud of who I am and the color of my skin, but because of my skin color, people aren't always nice to me. Sometimes I get called names. Other times, it's worse. The person doing it might not even realize that it hurts me a lot. And when they treat me that way, it makes me feel small. You see, some people believe that having different color skin means you aren't as good as others. That's called racism. What is racism? Racism means to hate someone, exclude them, or treat them badly because of their race or the color of their skin. And it happens all the time. Not just in big ways, but sometimes it shows up in small ways, ways that are almost invisible. Like a look, a comment, a question, a thought, a joke, a word, or a belief. Racism is one of the worst kinds of mean someone can be, because racism thinks being different is bad. But being different is actually good. Like really, 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 almost there, I promise. Really, 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 really good. 1000% good. Because being different means we have so much more to offer each other. Things like help, ideas, strength, skills, creativity, life, patience, respect, community, love, knowledge, experience, perspective, insight, diversity, wisdom, empathy, and originality. That whole being different thing, it makes us better, much better. So if you see someone being treated badly, made fun of, excluded from playing, or looked down on because of their skin color, call it racism.
All right, so that's where we were. So except for the slightly nebulous math there, 1000%, I think this book does a really great job of openly and respectfully engaging in the topic in a way that doesn't get so specific that it leaves children out. It doesn't get overly complicated. It uses vocabulary that they are able to understand even when they're very young. It uses the words race and racism, which again is incredibly important to name that specific, but it does a good job of not treating those words as anything to make a big fuss about. They're not taboo in any way. So children, particularly those who are not yet in school, may struggle with some concepts around this topic. That's to be expected. But what you can do is similar to what Jelani did. You can use concepts that they are familiar with to start to discuss what race or racism can mean for them. So fairness, kindness, or conversely, meanness. You can discuss feelings that both you and other people may have when involved with things to do with race or racism. So this is a book I think that will hopefully help ease them into understanding while they're still very young, so that as they grow older, you can continue to build on that vocabulary. And we will share after the program other books that you can use to talk about this topic. But again, however much we may want to have control over how and when these conversations start, it is possible that the opportunity is going to come up well before you feel like you're actually ready. It's going to present itself to you. So if, for instance, your child or the child that you're with notices someone who looks different than they do, it's important to keep in mind that they aren't inherently making a value statement about that person. So even though many adults and older children may feel uncomfortable if you hear someone say, again, that a person is Black or brown, saying that a person is Black or brown or a different skin color than you is not in and of itself offensive or harmful. And you want to agree with them. You don't want to try to ignore that comment. And when agreeing with them, you can say something along the lines of, yes, they do have brown skin. It's not the same as yours, but it's also nice. Just let them know that you heard them, that you understood that they were making an observation. If you ignore that comment that they make, it might send some messages to them. One of those messages that they may take away from that is that it's not okay to acknowledge differences, which again, I really agree with Jelani that differences are what make life really exciting and really great. And we don't want to erase those differences just because it might be something that makes us uncomfortable. So that's one message you might be sending if you completely ignore a comment where they're making that sort of observation. It also might be sending the message to them that race is just a taboo topic in general, that you're not supposed to talk about it, that it should stay hush hush. But again, that's really not what we want to do here. Now, on the other hand, if the child makes a value statement that is based on the color of someone's skin, for instance, if they see someone who doesn't look like them and they share that they're afraid of them, you should try to engage with them at that point on that. So you can say something like, no, they're not scary. They just look differently than you, or they have a different skin color than you. And then you can talk to them about how there are so many shades of skin colors in the world, and how a lot of that depends on where people's families are from and where they live. So there are a lot of ways that you can spin that into a topic about how we get the different skin colors that we have. Now, you can also ask them questions like, why do you think that? Or what makes you say that? You can also ask them, did something happen that made you think that? Or did something happen that makes you feel that way? As was mentioned in that book, again, trying to focus on feelings and things that young children can understand is a way that you can still have the conversation, even if they're not entirely grasping the concept of race or racism. So you're going to help them get there by using the terminology that they're already familiar with. You can mention that when we think things a certain way or say things a certain way, how that can make other people feel small or sad. And if that was done to us, that could make us feel small or sad. But books, wonderful as they are, as I mentioned, aren't the only way that we can talk about this. You can use other entry points to discuss race and racism. So history is a really fun and good way that you can do that. in a way that you can make it more or less specific about what it's meant in this country in particular. So you can mention things, if they're especially young, about some of our national and historical figures, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Cesar Chavez, plenty others that you can talk about. And what you can start with there is why it is that we honor them. You can let them know that we are acknowledging these people as leaders because they worked very hard to make things better and more fair for the people who are treated differently because of the colors of their skin. So that's one approach you can take. As they do get older and are in school, you can start discussing civil rights with them and let them know that there have been multiple things that have happened as a result of the civil rights movement that took place in the 1960s. So again, you can choose to share as much or as little there as you would like to make sure that you're not overwhelming them. So you're going to have to gauge their responses. And then, of course, for your much older children, and it is something that you can still bring up with younger children, but with care, is you can mention heavier topics such as slavery. It's, again, something that you're going to have to potentially do some of your own research on. Much of what we cover in school, or much of what children learn about in school, is a very small portion of that full picture. So this topic is not one without its homework continually. You can also use civic engagement as a way to talk to your children about race and racism. So one thing that we're in the middle of right now is a election cycle. So we are currently hopefully voting for someone for president and for any number of other positions across local, state, and national government. So what you can do to bring race into that topic, again, depending on the age of the child and how much you are familiar with, is you can start touching on some of the things that are lesser known parts of our voting history. So while we recently celebrated women getting the right to vote in 1919, many people aren't aware that Indigenous and Native Americans weren't granted citizenship in the US until 1924 and weren't guaranteed the right to vote in every state in the country until 1962. You can also talk, of course, about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which technically just outlawed discriminatory practices, but which in reality were preventing many Black Americans from being able to participate in voting. And then, of course, there's the current climate over the past few months, which has unfortunately given us some much scarier examples of race and racism and how that's come to a head. But I do urge you to, again, try to push on and talk about that with your children. They're noticing what's happening, and you want to make sure that you're there to help them feel better about what it is. So you, again, are going to want to, where possible, use gentler words. You don't want to say that Black men and women are being killed. What you might phrase that as is Black men and women are being hurt. Is there a difference? Yes, but you really need to be mindful of the sort of trauma that might come up if you are a little too specific, a little too accurate when they're so young. So you can let them know that people are protesting by marching because they're upset over bad things that have happened to people because of the color of their skin. Again, you're being honest, but you're putting it in a way that is appropriate for where those children are. And then as they get older, you're always welcome. And when I say get older, I really do mean as they are able to start having conversations with you. So it can still be pretty young. It's okay to start the conversation with them simply by asking, what do you already know about, and then insert a topic. So this is going to give you some insights into what it is they're seeing or hearing in the media, what they're picking up from friends, or what they're learning in their school setting. And lastly here, it is, again, important to remember, we're all going to make mistakes as part of these conversations. Again, none of us knows everything, and we may get things wrong. So as soon as you realize you've said something that is incorrect, just be sure to correct yourself as soon as possible. Make sure that you let your child see you correcting that mistake so that they understand, even if we do make mistakes, that we're always going to try to learn from them. So last but not least here, simply having conversations is not enough. Um, so that's sort of the fallacy here, the bait and switch, so to speak. We do want to talk to our children about this. We do want to have these conversations, but it's not enough to just do that. We can't stop there. Children need to see their parents and their caregivers modeling proper anti-racist behavior. And it's especially important that you do this from the start. So again, going back to that chart I showed you earlier, it's really important that in the first year of their life, your child is able to see you if possible. Pandemic might make it a little bit hard, but if possible, it's great to have them see you interacting with people who belong to other race and ethnic groups. That's going to help stem some of that behavior that we don't want to encourage as they grow older. Other things that you can do to move beyond conversations is being intentional about the toys, the books, and the other media that you're bringing into your home. And you want to make sure that you include as much representation within those things as possible. So even if your child has a toy, as an example, a doll that may look like them, and that's great for them, it truly is, you want to make sure that you also introduce toys that feature children who do look differently. It's great to have that variety. And it's an unfortunate case that a lot of picture books being published today still primarily feature white children, animals, or anthropomorphic objects, much more than they do children of color. So even with the increase we've seen of those representations, you're still going to have to do some work to make sure that you introduce other books that have that representation. And that's the same thing for television shows and movies. So make sure when you're sharing these things with your family that you aim to not only have that diversity and representation, but that you have that representation for people who don't look like you, doing some of the same things that you do. So you want to see people who look differently going shopping or going out and having fun at a park. It's important that we don't only introduce our children to the idea that those who are marginalized or those who look different than us, we don't want them to think that they only suffer because that's not a fair representation either. If you are able to, if you have a great access to museums or libraries, wink, wink, make sure that you're attending multicultural events that take place there, because that's a great way to learn more and to hopefully engage with other people, again, who don't look exactly like you or belong to the same groups that you do. You should try to do new community activities where you're likely to meet that same variety of people. And last but not least, if you are comfortable doing so, this is not for everyone, engaging in civic activities with the child. So that could be having them attend with you as you go to vote. It could be having them learn more about the process of protesting or other First Amendment rights. But having them get involved in that process early is a really great way to, again, introduce them to a wide variety of people and see you actually walking the walk and not just talking to them.